Shavua Tov. We're on Daf Mem Vav Amud Aleph, and we're moving towards the first Mishnah, which is in the middle of the Amud. But first, we have to go back and finish the sugya on the top of Mem Vav Amud Aleph. And the Gemara says, "Le'inyan siruf tuma v'pesach." This is a statement of Abaye, in which Abaye is trying to understand our Mishnah, v'chein le'inyan tuma. And he's trying to reinterpret the Mishnah because the simple, straightforward pshat in the Mishnah is very, very difficult. We don't understand how is it possible that the Mishnah would postulate an analogy between Tumah and Chametz. In the case of Tumah, everything should depend upon whether you're makpid or you're not makpid. You have a piece of Chametz that is stuck in the crevices of a utensil, and the question is whether you want to take out the butzeik, you don't want to take out the butzeik. Is it going to be something that you want to leave in the kli on a long-term basis and be mavatal to the kli because it actually enhances the utensil by protecting the water from going through? Or no, you're interested in taking out the butzeik. And the issue of chatzitza in tvila, when you have a kli that became tummy and now you want to be metired in a mikvah, whether or not the water is being separated from the kli itself by this butzeik that's stuck in the crevices, that depends on kpeda, not kpeda. On the other hand, chametz depends upon a shear of kizayis. So do you have to destroy the chametz? Do you not? Well, what's the size of the butzeik? And Abaye is grappling with this problem. How does the Mishnah postulate an equation? V'chein le'inyan tumah. V'chein meaning we're equating tumah and the laws of chatzitza with the chiyuv biur of chametz requiring, or shall we say, depending upon whether you have a kazayas of chametz or you don't. That doesn't make any sense. So Abaye comes up with a new interpretation. And according to Abaye, we're not going to talk about v'chein linyan tumah, period, as if to say there's an absolute equation between tumah and chametz that came before it. No. V'chein linyan tumah means that element and that dimension of kpeda, which plays a role in chametz as well, because again, if you have, let's say, pachos mikizayis of chametz, and you're not makpid, meaning you want it to stay exactly where it is, then you're not chayav in biur, so that kpeda plays a role. And in some cases, the lack of kpeda is considered absolute bittul, even if you had a kizayis of chametz, which would be the case of shulei akadera, if you recall. That element is v'chein linyan tumah. So as far as the equation between chametz linyan biur and tumah linyan chatzitza, kpeda is common to both of them. Do you want to leave this butzeik where it is and it's bottled to the kli, or do you want to remove it and take a screwdriver and wedge it out? However, says Abaye, there's another element that plays a role in which there's an overlap between tumah and chametz, and that is during the 7 days of Pesach. So let's read Abaye inside on the top of Daf Mem Vav Amud Aleph. Abaye says, "Le'inyan siruf tumah v'pesach." Interesting. We have one concept called siruf tumah, and we have another concept of b'pesach, on Pesach. Now we have to understand what siruf tumah is, and then why it should depend upon whether it's Pesach or it's not Pesach. So as far as siruf tumah is concerned, we're no longer discussing the issue of chatzitza. We've left that behind. As far as chatzitza is concerned, the single common denominator, there's only one between Pesach and chametz biur, and tumah is only as far as kpeda, not kpeda. Is it a chatzitza? Is it not? Etc. Etc. But now we go on, says Abai, to learn the latter part of the Mishnah in a different track, addressing a different issue, what completely, and that is Siruf. Now, the word Siruf Tumah here means kibetza. In Machols Asuris, the minimum shear is always a kizayis, but with regard to Tumah, and we're talking about Tumas Ochlin, the shear is kibetza, which is larger than a kizayis. And now we want to know if we can be mitzarev x plus y in order to achieve kibetza, so that you have two ochlin and they come in contact with each other, and together they form a kibetza. That's called siruf tumah. In our case, what you have is something that normally would not necessarily qualify for siruf tumah, but because it's Pesach, it's going to qualify for Tziruf Tumah. And what's the case? B'shayimos Hashana Ika Plugta. Plugta here refers to the difference between Makbid and Eno Makbid. So as far as the laws of Tumah are concerned, during the course of the year, all that we have to know is regard to this Batzeik of Chametz, whether or not he's makbid or he's not makbid, is a bottle to the kli, and therefore it's not a chotzeitz. Does he have intention to remove it from the kli, and therefore it's a chatzitza? Fine, that we understand. But hechi dami, how do we introduce the element of siruf tumah into the equation? And the Gemara answers, kigon the ika pachos mikabetza ochlin, the shear, the minimum shear for tumas ochlin is a kibetz, so less than a kibetz is not makabel tumas ochlin. The nagu, and you have ochlin that are less than a kibetz, which a present situation would not be makabel to it, but bahai beta nagu bahai beta they have batek, they have contact. This less than a kibetz of ochel comes into contact with a batek. And what is this batzeik? This is a batzeik that's trapped in the crevices of the areva, and the batzeik has a kizayis, which means that as far as chametz is concerned, before we get to the issue of tziruf tumah for a kibetza, we have a chiyuv biur because this batzeik, as the volume, has the minimum shear of a kizayis. Now what happens is there's a negia, as we said before, between ochel, which is less than a kibetza, and a batzeik, right? So imagine putting a piece of ochlin into this areva, and you have the batzeik on the bottom of the areva, on the sides of the areva, which come in contact with this piece of ochel. And now the Mishnah's Machadish, according to Abayi's very creative idea, because you have in this batzeik the volume of a kizayis, and we are talking on Pesach, the Torah gives it chashivus. Do you see that word chashiv? That's the key word here. Because of these chametz on Pesach, that kizayis of batzeik, which again in the shear of ochlin would not register on the Richter scale because it's less than a kibetza, now all of a sudden it becomes chashiv. And as a result of its chashivus, it stands out as an entity unto itself. It's not part of the areva. And even if normally we would say if it was less than a kizayis, it would be bottled to the areva. But since it's got a kizayis and there's an isur chametz and a chiyuv biur of chametz with a kizayis, it's no longer bottled to the areva. And if it's not bottled to the areva, then it can be mitztarev to a less than a kibetza's worth of ochlin, such that now that ochel is going to be makabel tumah. Imagine, as far as bittul is concerned, or as far as the logs of Kapeda is concerned, he's not makvid, and he wants to be mavatalid, and he wants this piece of batzeik to remain trapped forevermore in the crevice. He has no intention whatsoever of removing it. So it's batel and it has no chashivas. Norvos, because it's Pesach and because it has a kizayis of batek of chametz, therefore there's no din of bittul. Why? Because the Isur chametz is mafkia bittul. And that's in the case, let's say, of Dofnei HaRefa. Again, I don't want to get into the whole issue of Shulei HaKedera, but when we're talking about Dofnei HaKedera and Kedera, I mean HaRefa, then if it's got a Kizayis, we said it's not Batel, even though he's not Makir. If it's not Batel to the Kli, despite the fact that he's not Makir. But the reason why it's not Batel is because the Isur Chametz generates chashivus because he's got a kizayis of batzek. His memela, I can now be mitzarif that batzek when it comes in contact with ochlin to be mashlim the shear of kibetza, such that now the ochel will be makabel tumah. If a sheret falls on the ochel now is contaminated. Why? Because today is Pesach, and the shem chametz of a kizayis, with all that it implies, will generate a chashivus that undermines the normal law of bittul, and because I have to destroy it, b'toras chametz, it's a separate entity. I got to wedge it out and destroy it and burn it, and it's not part of the kli, even though I'm not maked it. I'm going to leave it there, but I have to get rid of it because it's chametz. That gives it chashivus, such that now I can be mitzari through maga, through negia, the kizayis of batzek with the less than a kibetza of ochel, in order to be mashin the shir of kibetza. Now it's makabel to. But shayim os hashana, then forget about chametz. There is no shame chametz to shayim os hashana, and therefore bikpeda talia milsa. We're going to reduce our discussion to one and only one element, and that is: does he want to leave it in the areva long term? He's not makbid, or he wants to get rid of it. And if he decides that he wants to be part of the areva, it's batel to the areva, and it has no chashivus. It now cannot be integrated together with the ochel because it's part of the kli. It's not ochel. So that even though it has a shear of kizayis during the whole year round, it will not be mitzaref because it's batel. What makes it batel? The fact that he's not makbid. In makbid ola mitzaref. If on the one hand he wants to take out this batzek, he's going to take a screwdriver, like we said, or some sort of kli, and he's going to remove it. Then it's not batel to the areva, and then we have the classic case of two ochlin maga. This one has half a beitza, this one has half a beitza, and then mitzaref to shear. But in Rotza B'Iyun, he wants it to stay in the arev because the areva, because it benefits the areva. Is then areva, it's batel to the areva, and it cannot be viewed as an ochel to be mitzarefed together with other ochlin and be mashlim the shear of kibetza. So if we go back now and read the Mishnah according to Abaye, let's turn back to the Mishnah for a moment. We have to sort of add a comma and more into the Mishnah. The Mishnah says on Daf Mem Hey Amud Aleph, Batzek shebesidkei areva, im yesh kizayis b'makom echad chayav levayer, v'im lav batel b'miyuto. Now, what we're talking about is a case of a batzek, which, if it has a kizayis b'makom echad, it's chametz, even though he's not makbid and he wants to be makayim it in the areva, it's asuri lechazek. But if it's less than a kizayis, then since he's not makbid, he wants it to be makayim long term. It's asuri lechizek. Therefore, it's batel to the areva, and he doesn't have a chovas biur of a v'chein tuma. Now, what is v'chein tuma going on? According to Abaye, it's only referring to one of the two elements in the equation, namely whether he's makbid or he's not makbid, whether he wants to be mavakel to the kli and be makayim in the kli, or he's makbid to get it out of the kli, has nothing to do with the volume of the batzek, whether it's a kizayis or less. And now we have to put a carrot and ule inyan siruf tuma im v'chein linyan tuma. So the v'chein linyan tuma now is splitting into two. Let me just read to you one line over here. He says, Masha shaninu v'chein linyan tuma midubar b'yemei Pesach. So in other words, the equation between the batek of kpeda, not kpeda, and tuma, that equation during the entire course of the year applies with regard, as I said before, to kpeda. But when it says v'chein tuma, that's referring to Yemei Pesach. And when it says at the end of the Mishnah is makbid and it's chotzetz, or on the contrary, is rotzel kiyumo, and then arei hika reva, areu ka reva, that's referring to shari mos hashon. So it's amazing how you have to split the Mishnah according to Abaye into two. The Mishnah is saying v'chein linyan tuma with regard to Pesach, which means that whether or not you'll have a tzir of tuma depends upon a kazayas or less than a kazayas. And then, as far as the rest of the year is concerned, in makpid olav chotzetz, the imrotza v'kiyumo arehu ka'arefa. In other words, whether or not it's chotzetz depends totally on kapeda or the lack thereof. Maskifle rava miktani mitztarev. Where does it say in the Mishnah that there's an issue that's being addressed in the Mishnah about Siruf Tuma? According to you, Abaye, what should have happened over here is that the Mishnah should have clearly indicated that we're dealing with an issue of Tziruf, and then we're dealing with an issue, B'Shayimos Hashana, of Kpeda or not Kpeda, meaning of Chatzitza or the lack of Chatzitza. Where does the Mishnah indicate some sort of a transitional discussion where we move from Pesach to Shayimos Hashana, moving from the issue of Siruf Tuma to set up a kibetz's worth of Ochel, and the issue is whether it has Chashivus or it doesn't, and since you have a Kizayis, it has Chashivus Linyan Chametz, it generates an Isu Chametz, it's an entity unto itself. I couldn't care less whether he's Makbid or not Makbid, and therefore could be Mitztarif, but if it's Shayimos Hashana or not. Where does it say that? All it does is address the issue of Kpeda. Elama Rava goes back to V'chein Linyan Tuma, and he says V'chein lahalos Tara or Tara le'areva, which means the following: you have in a crevice a kizayis of batzek. Hechi dami, he going to itame hai areva. According to Rava, we're dealing with the laws of mikvahos with regard to kelim and the laws of chatzitza. This areva contracted tumah. Boilat bule. He wants to be mitayah the kli, the areva, by placing it into a mikvah. The Pesach, the isuro choshiv, chotzetz. Forget about siruf tumah. Abaye, with all due respect to your fantastical creativity, and we're talking about a case of being mashlim ochel together with this batek to be mashlim the shear of kibbetz of a kabbalas ochel, tumas ochel. Forget about all that. Let's focus exclusively on the issue of chatzitza and the issue of kpeda. In a certain sense, Rava is on board with Abaye in the fundamental breakthrough of Abaye, namely that this overlap between Tumah and Pesach means that the dinim of Tumah that would apply the whole year round are different than the dinim of Tumah that apply during Pesach. That major breakthrough Abai gets the credit for it, and Rav is going to accept it. But whereas Abai introduced a whole new element, a whole new issue of tzir of tuma to get a share of kibetza for ochlin, Rava says cut that all out. There's no indication in the Mishnah that the Mishnah is addressing that. Let's discuss kpeda. Let's discuss chatzitza exclusive, and yet we can differentiate between the 7 days of Pesach and the rest of the year. Pesach di surah chashiv. In the case of chametz Pesach during these 7 days, there's no bittul. And why is there no bittul? Because we have chashivas, and the chashivas of the Isur chametz undermines bittul. Again, very reminiscent. This is not something new. This is something that we saw in Abayit. And therefore, lo salkale tvila, the batzek now serves as a chatzitza. Why is it serving as a chatzitza? As we said over and over again, because of the chashivus of the shem chametz. It's a kezayis' worth of chametz, generates a shem yisur chametz, and we're dealing during the days of Pesach. B'shayavos Hashana, the exact same scenario. Nothing has changed except the calendar date. Is B'Peda Talia Milsa. Imakbid Olav. Chotzeitz, Imrotza B'Kiyumo, Harehu Ka'areva. In other words, the reason why our Mishnah in the third parak of Pesachim wedges the laws of Tumah, specifically the laws of Chatzitza, into a Mishnah that deals with Chametz and the Chiyuv Bir of Chametz and the violation of Bal Yimatzeh in Chametz, is only because of this Areva, which in Hilchos Chametz will generate a Chashivus if it has a Kezayis, and will be Mafkia Bittul to the Areva. That halacha of Chashivus of Chametz that prevents Bittul has implications as far as the laws of Chatzitza in that same Areva that was Makabel Tumah, he wants to be Mitarin in a mikvah. That because we're dealing with a Shem Chametz that's Mafkia Bittul, that has an impact on the laws of Peda as far as Chatzitza is concerned. You and I would have said, well, you know what? The man is very happy that the Batzek will stay there trapped in the crevice from now until the end of time. He's not makbid, and therefore it should not be a chatzitza. And the answer is nay, because it's a kezayis chametz. And now the calendar date is Pesach. That generates the chashivas as a result of the shem yisur chametz. That kezayis of batzek is now not batel. We are removing bittel. B'shayavos hashana already. This has nothing to do with chametz, because b'shayavos hashana there's no shem yisur chametz. Now we get into the application of the laws of Chatzitza, which are totally dependent upon Kedah or the lack thereof. But the overlap and the justification for introducing the Chen Linyan Tumah is the 7-day period of Pesach. Maskif la Rav Papa. You know what, Rav? You're not any better than Abai, in terms of how you're going to fit your interpretation of the Mishnah into the language of the Mishnah. The problem is still very, very prominent. Why? Because Miktani v'chein Tara, if the Mishnah was discussing the issue of taking this kli, this hareva, and after it was makabel tumah, putting it into a mikvah for Tara, then v'chein inyan Tara would have been the appropriate language. Tara means tvila. Is this tvila valid or not? And the answer is it depends on the same elements that go into the equation of chametz v'pesach in the case of the batzek. Meaning that if this batzek is a kezayis, that gives a chashivas, it's not batel. And therefore, v'chein linyan Tara, if you want to take the reva to the mikvah, you have a problem, because either A, you are makpid, or B, even if you weren't makpid, since it's Pesach, it has a chshivas that's generated by the shem Isur Chametz. Then it should have said v'chein le'inyan tar. What's v'chein le'inyan tuma doing over here? You want to know whether the tara process is valid or not? And on Pesach, it's going to be a problem because it's not batal, even if he's not makted, because of the Shem Yisur Chametz. So then you should have said v'chein le'inyan tara, meaning mikvah. Tvila b'mikvah will be impacted by the Shem Yisur Chametz. Elamar Rav Papa. Oh, so let's see if Rav Papa can justify v'chein le'inyan tumah. And he says the following: that v'chein le'inyan lahorid tumah la'reva. What does that mean? So we're not talking about creating tara through tvila. We're talking about creating tumah. Hechi dami. Kigon did noga sheretz bahai botzek. You have a kezayis of botzek that's trapped in the crevices of the areva, and it comes in contact with the sheretz, a dead sheretz. Is the din is the following: the Pesach, the isuro. In other words, the kezayis of chametz, the shem chametz, is chashuv, right? What emerges as a result of the fact that you have a kezayis of botzek and it's Pesach is a special chashivus that prevents the chametz, the botzek, from being bottled to the areva. Is then chotzes, but not chatzitza and hilchos mikvos, not chatzitza and tvila, but chatzitza in kabbalas tumah. That's the language over a papa le'inyan lahorid tumah l'areva. That it's chotzes, which means lo nachasoloch tumah. The botzek now is wedging between the sheretz and the areva. So the sheretz landed punkt on this kezayis of botzek. The bad news is that it's Pesach, and therefore he's got to get rid of this kezayis of botzek. But the good news is that he doesn't have to take the areva to the mikvah, because the kezayis botzek of chametz, which he has to get rid of, is now a chatzitza, not in the sense of chatzitza shel tvila, but chatzitza le'inyan kabbalas tumah. And now it's a foreign element which separates the sheretz from the areva. When you don't have the chashivus of the Shem Yisur Chametz, then the Kpeda Talia Milsa, everything depends upon Kpeda. If he's not makpid, meaning he intends to leave that kezayis of botzek exactly where it is, plugging up the crevice of the areva, then it's bad news for the kli, for the areva itself, because the sheretz now has fallen onto the kli. He intends to leave the botzek there ad infinitum. But in makpid olav, if his intention is to remove that kezayis of botzek, because he doesn't feel it's doing him any good in terms of plugging up the crevices of this areva, then chotzes. Now, Baruch Hashem, we're happy to announce that this botzek is a separate entity unto itself. It should not be unified or identified with the areva. So if the sheretz came in contact with the botzek and not with the areva remains tahora. However, in Rotza B'Kiyumo, if his intention is to leave the botzek there ad infinitum because it serves to embellish the function of the kli, then arehu ke'areva, then it's bottled to the areva v'sharim al sashana, and therefore, unfortunately, the areva is now going to be makabel tumah when the sheretz falls on top of this botzek. But had it been Pesach and the same thing would have happened, and you've got a kezayis of botzek, which is now also b'torah sisur chametz. It's not batal even if he's not makpid. He's rotza b'kiyumo. He wants to be it in the areva. Nevertheless, the good news is that it's going to be a chatzitza between the sheretz and the kli. Now I have to tell you, emotionally, I feel that Abaye is the most exciting of all these interpretations. But Rava is trapped here because of the language of the Mishnah. Says Rav Papa, if you're rejecting Abaye because you don't think that Abaye's pshat fits into the Mishnah, and you're reading the Mishnah so meticulously, then you have a problem as well. It should have said L'chein Le'inyan Tvila, which means L'chein Le'inyan Tara, but not L'chein Le'inyan Tuma. And in that sense, Rav Papa, from the perspective of the text of the language of the Mishnah, is the most satisfying of all these perushim. You get the impression that Rav Papa was the final word here in this Mishnah, because he is absolutely committed to the language of the Mishnah. We're talking about whether or not the Areva is Makabel Tuma. When the Sheretz comes down and lands on the Batzik in the Stukim of the Areva. And here Pesach is good news because the Shem Yisur Chametz in a Kezayis of this Batzik, which generates a Chiyuv Biur, and a Shem Chametz, is Mafkia Bittel, meaning, again, the same idea that we had over and over again in Abaye and Rava, but here Rav Papa is applying it in a whole different context. And that is to be Mafkia Bittel, such that now the Batzik is not part, it's not an integral part of the Areva itself. Hence, when the Sheretz falls on the Batzik, it serves as a wedge between the Sheretz and the Areva. If on the other hand, it's Shar Yemos Hashana, now Rotze B'Kiyumo becomes a Chumrah, Sibas HaTuma, and the Tuma of the Sheretz is now Yoredes Al Gabi Hareva. Why? Because he's Rotze B'Kiyumo, means he wants the Batzik to stay there ad infinitum, and therefore it's part of the Kli. It's part of the Kli, then it makes no difference whether the Sheretz fell on the Batzik or it fell on the Kli itself. It's all the same. But if he's not Makti, or I should say it the other way around, if he's not Rotze B'Kiyumo, and therefore he's Makti, meaning he wants to get rid of this piece of Batzik and wedge it out, then it becomes a Chatzitza, and the Areva is not Makabel. And this, my friends, leads us to the new Mishnah. The Mishnah has a very strange phrase here, just in terms of terminology, and that's called Batzik HaCheresh, the Batzik of someone who's deaf. I mean, what does deafness have to do with anything? And the Mefarshim say that the etymology here, the use of the Shoresh Cheresh here in this context, is that in the case of someone who's hard of hearing, you look at his ears and you have no way of knowing what he's hearing. I mean, now we have all sorts of sophisticated methods of testing one's hearing, but just from a distance, you see a person with ears, but you know that he's hard of hearing. You don't know, you scream at the top of your lungs. Does he hear you? Does he not hear you? You're not too sure about it. So the cheresh idea here is the lack of clarity, the ambiguity of in this case, whether he's hearing you or not. And the Batzik HaCheresh is a dough, and we're not sure exactly how long of a time lapse has passed since he added the water to the flour, and therefore, what is the identity of this Batzik HaCheresh? Is it chametz? Is it not chametz? And before we get to the Mishnah itself, let's just mention that there's a machlokas tanoim as to how to identify a batzik as either chametz or not chametz, because there are different stages of fermentation. There's an early stage, and that's going to be a tremendous machlokas tanoim, and there's a later stage. And in the early stage, the Gemara says, all you have to look at the dough and indicate that maybe it's chametz is simply it's beginning to ferment. It's on a very, very early stage. It doesn't have the crevices that normally will be seen in a dough, but it changes its color a little bit. So again, we're going to get into some of the details later on, not in this Mishnah, but in the later Mishnah. Our Mishnah here is indicating what we call a time element into the equation. I mean, we're all very familiar with the 18-minute baking process. You know, if you, I never did it, but my Talmidim are very into this thing of, you know, going to the matzah factories and watching what goes on over there. So it's a pretty wild scene. You know, people are yelling and screaming, and it's, because if the dough is left unattended for a period of 18 minutes, then the assumption is that it's too late to make it into matzah. It's already chametz. So we'll get hopefully we'll figure out where this 18-minute shear of kneading the dough, and whether it's chametz or matzah, where did it come from? The Mishnah goes on a slightly different path. It says, "Im yesh kayotze bo." Oh, so let's take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, "Batzek hacheresh." Right? It's about what should we say, 25 lines up from the bottom, or 35 lines down from the top. I don't know. Batzek hacheresh she'ein nikar im hichmitz im lav. So the word cheresh here means, did it become chametz yet or did it not? The Mishuna hu kecheresh hazeh sheyesh lo zmayim ve'enu nikar shomeam lav. That's what we said before. Ein adam omed al biruro val daito. Okay, that's one way of interpreting the word cheresh. But again, even in Rashi's second interpretation, the word cheresh means eino nikar im hichmitz im lav. L'shnachrina botzek hacheresh koshek kecheresh v'eino nikar shehichmitz. Now, when he says eino nikar shehichmitz, you'll take a look at a line in Rashi which is questionable. We're not sure if it really is authentic, if this is part of Rashi. Most likely it was added by someone else at some later period of time. Ratzaloma hechsifu panav v'ein siduk l'simon achimus. So Rashi here is already indicating the two stages of fermentation. The first is called hechsifu panav, which literally means its face got white. However, Rashi says it hasn't reached the final stage of chimutz, which is called siduk, meaning lo olubo sdakim. So let's go through these two stages. Stage number one is machsifim panav. And a person who's overwhelmed by fear, he turns white. Now, anger maybe is red, but fear is white. He's white as a ghost. You've heard that phrase. And that's hechsifu panav. And elsewhere, not here, but Rashi says that when a person is overwhelmed by fear, his hairs stand on end. Sha'amdu sarosav machmas pachat. All right, so that's stage number one. And there are shitos that's already considered chametz. The achakach, stage number two, nasim al habotzek stukim echad lekan the echad lekan, and the Gemara compares it to karne chagovin. So you have, I guess, we'll call it grasshoppers for the lack of precision over here, and the horns of the grasshoppers sort of shoot out in different sides, in different ways, in different directions. Now, if you hold that it's not chametz until the second stage, which is one sheet in Tanoim, and that's called Kikarne Chagovim, then apparently Karne Chagovim is still a Botek HaCheresh because there are two stages in Karne Chagovim. One stage is when there are very few Sdokim, there are a couple of haphazardly, thrown around, there are these crevices. And then you have Nisrabu HaSdokim. That's already in a more advanced stage. Everybody agrees that once it's Nisrabu HaSdokim, it's Chometz Gomur, it's not Chometz Cheresh, Botek Cheresh. But when is it Botek Cheresh? According to this Shita, that's in the middle. What do I mean in the middle? You've gone beyond the first stage of Nichsefu Panav, but you didn't get to the last stage of Nisrabu Asdokim. You only have a few, as we said before, here, there, and elsewhere on the face of the dough, you have Stokim, but it's not the real McCoy Stokim. Holzman Shalo Olubo Stokim. If there are no Stokim at all, we're going to go according to that mind. The Yom says Hadayin Eno Nechshav Chametz. It's not real Chametz. And according to Rabbi Meir, Hichsifu Panav is already Chametz. Why? Because of the concept called Seyar. Do you remember we spoke about Roy Lechamea Bo Isos Acheres, that it's a leavening agent? So that's the Shita of Rabbi Meir, and Botek Shechsifu Panav equals Seyar, and you're not allowed to eat it, you have to destroy it, but he's not Chayv Kares for it. Then we get to Rabbi Yehuda's Shita. And all this we'll see later on in Daf Mem Ches, but it's important here on Mem Vav. Rabbi Yehuda holds that when does it become Chametz, which is called Seyar in this context, that's Kishenase Kikarne Chagovim. It's not enough Hechsifu Panav. We need the second stage of Kikarne Chagovim. And we mentioned this, if you recall, at the beginning of the parak. According to Rabbi Yehuda, Keshechsifu Panav, Adayin Eno Chametz Klal. It doesn't have the status of Chametz, it's Matzah. And it's Mutar Ba'anah. Okay, Midrabanan, it's also Bachila, but it's Mutar. Fine. So now, Botek HaCheresh, Rashi says, it's Chsifu Panav, which means that the Mishnah is going according to Rabbi Yehuda, because Chsifu Panav, according to Rabbi Meir, is Chametz Gomor. But yet you could ask the following question: if Rashi is right that our Mishnah is talking about a case of Chsifu Panav, then according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's Matzah. So that doesn't fit into our Mishnah. Harei b'Mishnah mashma shem ein botzei kayotze bo shehichmitz ein isur le'achla. So the question is going to be, if it's only a Chsifu Panav, and we're going to Rabbi Yehuda, then the Mishnah is going to say under certain circumstances it's also, but according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's Matzah. It's not even Chametz. So he quotes the Rambam in the 5th parak of Chametz to Matzah. The Maggid Mishnah embellishes the Rambam that Botek HaCheresh is Seir, which again is Asur Le'ochlo under separate lav without Kares. And therefore, when we're talking about Botek Shechsifu Panav, our Mishnah reflects the sheet of Rabbi Meir. And we're going to paskin like Rabbi Meir, says the Rambam. And Chsifu Panav, it's already considered Chametz, but it's not Chametz, it's Seyar. and it's also liochlo v'ein chayovin aleha kares. That's according to the Rambam. Now, we say that it's called a cheresh because we don't know, like a cheresh who has ears. It's ein unikar v'shomei lo ein adam omed al tivo v'daito. And now we're going to approach the Mishnah, and we have some arsenal in our on our body. You know, we have the armor. According to Rashi, especially if you accept that gears at the end of Rashi, we're going according to Rabbi Yehuda, and that means that since it's only kekarnei chagovim, therefore we're not sure whether it's chametz or not. In fact, we are pretty sure it's not chametz, unless, and that's what the Mishnah is going to stipulate. According to the Rambam, we're going to read this Mishnah according to Rabbi Meir. We paskin like Rabbi Meir. And normally, kekarnei chagovim would be chametz, but the Mishnah is telling us that it is a candidate not for chametz but for seyar, and it's not absolute and automatic that once it reaches the state of sifu panav, then it is seyar, and the Mishnah is going to stipulate a condition. So again, according to Rashi, our Mishnah is reflecting the shita of Rav Yehuda, and then we have to work it out and see under what circumstances could Rabbi Yehuda agree that Chsifu Panav is already usher according to the Torah law. According to the Rambam, we're going and reading this Mishnah from the perspective of Rabbi Meir. And the question is, at what point is Chsifu Panav considered Seir? So what does the Mishnah establish? Im yesh kayotze bo shehichmitz harei ze asur. Very interesting. You have Reuven who's working on a dough, and you have Shimon who's working on another dough, and they both started exactly at the same time. They were in sync. Shimon's dough became chametz. And that's clear. The Mishnah establishes, therefore, Reuven's dough is also chametz. But even though Reuven's dough does not manifest the same simanim that Shimon's dough did, Shimon is clearly kekarnei chagovim. It's in the second stage, and therefore it's chametz. We have no doubt about that. But since Reuven's batzek hacheresh began its process of chimutz exactly at the same time as Shimon's, therefore we assume that just like Shimon's dough reached the state of chametz without a shadow of a doubt, then even Reuven's dough that has not manifested the same simanim that we normally would require is considered chametz. Very new halacha. And again, if we're going with Shitas Rashi here and Rabbi Yehuda, which means that we're talking about Hichsifu Panav, then the Mishnah is establishing a very, very revolutionary concept that even Rabbi Yehuda could be modeh, that in the absence of Simonei Chimutz, which according to Rabbi Yehuda means Kekarnei Chagovim, and that we don't have here in this stuff. All we have is a Chsifu Panav, but because of the fact that there happens to be another dough that became chametz and started and ended at the same time, T1, T2 framework, therefore, this dough is considered chametz. It's seir, even though it doesn't manifest the simon. Now, if on the other hand, we're going to learn this Mishnah the way the Rambam did, and we're talking in the context of Rabbi Meir, then we have to figure this out. Rabbi Meir is on the books. He's committed to the position that Sifu Panav is chametz. It's seir. Why does the Mishnah make it in this batzek acheres? Why does it make it dependent upon Im yesh kayotzi b'zeh shehich. So Rashi comes up with the following. Rashi says, Im yesh isa cheres shenilosha b'shaita ukfar hichmitza hareza osa, right? Just 1 second. Does he add anything here? Ah, it says b'shaita. That's a little bit vague. He says that the right use in Rashi is bi'osa shah, which is very similar to what Rashi says in Rashi on the Rif. Okay, that's a whole issue. But in any event, so what is Rashi telling us here? Rashi is saying that normally this would not be considered chametz. Again, Rashi holds that we're going according to Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yehuda says that hichsifu panav is not chametz. But even though, according to Rabbi Yehuda, the time period that passed would not be enough to create chametz, there's no fermentation process is very immature, very, very limited. Nevertheless, kevan shanu roim she'echad hichmitz, we see that another dough during that same period of time, which is not enough to create chimutz, but it became chametz, then al korchenu we have no choice, but we have to assume that the osa makom, that in that location, and I don't know what he means location on the face of the earth, how close to the equator are you, or he means location in terms of the room, where there's heat in the room. Kevan shechamimus meruba, we have an unusually sped up process of fermentation as a result of the heat. We thought that chimutz is we can scientifically analyze chimutz and tell you exactly when this became chametz. And we're going to establish that universally for all doughs in the world. But no, that's not true. There's another variable in the equation, which makes it relative. It's no longer objectified or absolute, and that is chamimus. So again, we're not talking about some sort of supernatural miracle that every other dough on the face of the earth would not have reached fermentation and chimutz with the passage of, let's call it 5 minutes, and there was a miracle. This dough defies the natural order of the universe. No. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is apparently there are other scientific elements into the equation. There are physical elements that could speed up the process of chimutz. It's not an angel from Shamayim. Again, all this is according to Rashi. I mean, we have to start from scratch according to the Rambam, because the Rambam's holding that this Mishnah reflects the sheet of Rabbi Meir, and Hichsif Panav is chametz. So why do I have to compare it to another dough and say, well, it must be that there's certain factors here that are operating? So let's read the Gemara. The Gemara about Batek Acherish. And the Gemara says, what is the Mishnah telling me about the status of this Batek had there not been another Batek? Im ein sham kayotze bo mahu, Amar Rabbi Yavo, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Kidei sheyelech adam migdal dunya l'teveria meal. Okay, look, you got lucky, and there was another dough that was baked at the same time as your dough. So you lucked out. But what do you do if you don't luck out? This is the only dough that you have. Here I think maybe the Rama makes more sense because according to Rashi, we look at the dough and all it has is hichsif panav. And if you're going according to Rabbi Yehuda, that's not simone chimus. So what's Rabbi Avo saying here in the name of Shimon Lakish? But let's go the other way around. Let's take the Rambam now. We're talking about hichsifu panav according to Rabbi Meir, because we're passing like Rabbi Meir. The Gemara is saying hichsifu panav is a simon if a certain period of time went by from the moment that you started kneading the dough. How much time went by? The time it takes to walk from Nunya to Tveria. How much is that? How far is Nunya to Tveria? We all know. It's a meal. And let's assume it takes 18 minutes to walk a meal. I don't know. So the Gemara says, the name of meal, Hakamashmalan the Shiura the meal, Ki, Shiura, the Adam, Mi Migdal, Nunya, the Ad Tveria. So why did Reish Lakish say Migdal Nunya Litveria? Why didn't he just say meal? And the answer is, you want to know how long it takes to walk a meal, then take a good spatzir, from Migdal Nunya and walk to Tveria, and it's very close, and you'll get there in a certain amount of time, and that amount of time is the amount of time it takes to walk a meal. And it seems like the Mishnah now is establishing that the simanim are less important. What's more important is how long has elapsed, how much time has elapsed since the time of givul, when the water was poured into the dough, or to the flour, I should say, and how long of a time period has passed. The time it takes to walk a meal is then we're going to assume it became chametz. Now here, the Turi Evan, that's the Shagsari, asks a very simple question. He says, Dover Yadua, Shashir Mil Hu Alpayim Amma. All of a Shas, a meal is 2,000 Amma. He says, nevertheless, Yesh She'eno B'kiyas B'medida. We're not always experts in surveying the land and calculating exactly how large or how distant of how long is the distance between these 2 points. So the chiddush here is that he'll take steps and he walks at a normal average pace, and he can figure out what the share of Alpayim Amor. So in other words, he's not a Baki Medida, where they used to take the pole, and dig it into the ground here, and then they knew that there was a rope of 2,000 Amor. They weren't Bekiyim in that. They didn't have any land surveyors. What did they do? They took a walk from Migdal Nunya over to Tveria, pretty short walk, and they got there in 18 minutes, or whatever time it was. Okay, Rabbi, so I think we'll stop here. We're up to Omer Rabbi Avo. Let's make a note of where we got up to. And I'll take this opportunity to wish you all a great day. Thank you. Thank you so much.